dropping some knowledge and a little love. This is the Fire on Your Head podcast with your host, Steve Bremner. Steve Bremner, missionary to Peru and blogger at stevebremner.com. The podcast where we tackle gray areas your pastor doesn't talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bremner.
Greetings, friends. Welcome to the show. Steve here. I know it's been a little while. Well, not a little while if you're new to this podcast and you're just going through the archives and listening to these one after the other. But for those of you who wait for these to come out, I've been busy. But I think today's podcast is well worth the wait. This week, I interviewed Derek Snook. He's the author of a book called The Definition of Success: What Living Homeless Can Teach You. And we're going to get to that in a moment. You know, Derek is like myself, a fellow independent author. And I think Derek should be more well known. I enjoyed the conversation with him, and I think you will too. And not only will you enjoy the conversation with him, but I think you'll enjoy his book as well. He lived homeless for a year. He intended on doing it for a day, but it lasted a year. Shortly after he had finished college, he's, I think, did he say 32 or 30? I can't remember. You'll hear it in the discussion. And I met Derek through a Facebook group for authors, and we connected, became friends. And I offered, or, invited him to be on the podcast sometime. And that was that. I meant it. I wasn't, just offering that for nothing. And, recently he got back in touch with me to see if my offer still stood. And, I was embarrassed. I was like, yeah, let's do this. So this interview is from about 3 weeks ago. And here's the deal. I've been busy trying to feed my family. I like having food and shelter and stuff. And I just started a new audiobook project that I'm not going to say much about. And just took on a ghostwriting project. I'm not sure, if I'm going to be signing a non-disclosure agreement, but I've received the first installment. And so I'm recording this late on a Thursday night, and on Monday, I'm going to be interviewing this author for our first of several scheduled Skype interviews to get my content and, get my details that I can work with. So anyway, I want to get to the interview with Derek. I'll share some of my own reflections on it at the end. So here's my interview with Derek Snook. Welcome, Derek Snook, to this podcast. Did I pronounce your name right?
You did.
Okay, I didn't know if it was Snook or Snook or what. And he's the author of a book called The Definition of Success: What Living Homeless Can Teach You. And we're going to get to that in a moment as to how that came about and why he wrote this book. But yeah, say something, Derek, so everybody knows you're here.
Hey, everybody, I'm here.
Good stuff. So yeah, right now you're talking to me from England, but you're from the States.
Right, I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, and I spent the last year living in New York, and then I actually came to Europe in March. I booked a return ticket for May 2nd, and I did not show up for that flight. So now I'm actually trying to buy a car in Russia and drive back through Mongolia back to the UK.
I was going to say, I hope he's not about to say he's going to drive back to the States, because I don't think they have that yet.
No.
Okay, so you've been in Europe since May, and what took you there?
So I was actually starting to research a second business. So the first one is the one that I started out of the year that I voluntarily lived homeless, and then I came over here to research a second one that was really based around communities. So I stayed actually in a refugee camp for a couple weeks in Greece. I stayed in a community where it was intergenerational. So elderly people lived with students, and then also in a community where people with intellectual disabilities live with people who don't have intellectual disabilities. And I've been kind of on that journey, thinking about that, really exploring deeply at the heart of it, the question of what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And that's kind of where I'm at right now in discerning that process.
Right. Okay, so this is I've written down a few questions to come back to when we get going into this. So I guess maybe this is an okay point to start on. So take me to before you decided to live homeless. Like, how old are you?
32.
Okay, so you're not like, fresh and brand new to the world. So what were you doing, like, before deciding to take on this experiment or this project?
So I was a college student. I went to a small liberal arts school called Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I played Division I basketball. I was a walk-on, scored 2 points in my career, and gave everybody on both teams a high five. But when I graduated from school, I was kind of deeply, troubled's not the right word, but searching. So I was looking for meaning and purpose in my life, specifically as it related to vocation. And then as soon as I graduated from school, I spent like 6 months paying off student loans. And then I went to Kenya and worked at a school for orphans. And I was there for 4 months, and I felt kind of a disconnect between people who want to help and the people that they're trying to help. And I realized that the more that I could walk in someone's shoes, the better chance I could help them. And then I realized that same problem existed with people where I was from, which was people who are low-income employees or who are homeless 7 miles from where I grew up in a kind of middle upper class suburb. And so those two things combined with this last very important one, which is that I'm the son of a Baptist minister. When we talked about loving our neighbors ourselves, it kind of meant people who looked like us, voted like us, thought like us, and behaved like us. And I became so disillusioned with that by the time I got to college that I was just ready to throw it out the window. And I thought, before I do that, like, this is a pretty serious question. I should try to live in the smallest possible way that I can, the way that Jesus actually says to live. And there's a lot of different things I could have done. But for me, living homeless for that year, which just started out as a day, I stayed for a year because I loved it so much. That kind of became the step for me. So does that make sense? Does that give you an idea of where I started and how I got to that decision? Oh yeah,
I can relate and understand. But you caught my attention when you said that you initially wanted to do it for a day and it led to a year because you loved it. I'd love to hear more about how you loved that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is that, like, anytime we're kind of acting in faith, like, it's the confidence of things that we can't see. There's no certainty. It's oftentimes fear-inducing. And so part of the reason I only said a day was because, like, I was really afraid. The other thing that people like to do is pretend that I, like, made this decision so I could start a business and so I could write a book. But the reality is that first day I had no plan. Like, I was just terrified and I was just following my gut and what I felt like God was asking me to do. I ended up loving that year because it opened my eyes to the world and it changed my life. And I just want to add too that what's important to notice is that, like, I could have left at any time and I had some choices that other people did not have. And so, like, in no way do I want to be making, like, light of their pain. It was hard for me in some ways, but it was much, much harder for them. And it's important to just recognize that, like, I did have a different perspective of what I was experiencing, but the point is kind of, I wanted to do what I could to experience what they were experiencing. And so this became a way to do that. The ways that I loved it fundamentally was that it challenged my entire life up to that point and this pursuit of success. And what I realized was that the success that we are taught where I'm from in the United States leads us to self-absorption, isolation, and stress. The success that we want is a life of purpose that means helping others, community, and having a guide. And I can remember, I know I'm talking for a little while now, but
no, that's fine.
The first day that I moved in, I went to the back porch, I sat down, and I met this guy named Walter. And I've changed everybody's names to protect their privacy. And one of the first things that Walter told me is that he had a demon living inside of him. And so I was already kind of afraid moving in. And so this guy tells me, we're sitting on the back porch, he's wearing a white t-shirt and he's smoking a cigarette, and he tells me he has a demon living inside of him. I'm 22 years old. I'm pretty afraid that he's going to just, kill me then and there. But the more I got to know Walter, the more I understood why. And Walter actually used to work as a worship leader at a church. And he had a wife, and his wife was pregnant. His wife gave birth to a stillborn child, and he found out that the child was not his. And so I would actually take Walter to church. And I can remember times when our pastor would be praying, "God, you are so great." And the entire auditorium is silent. And Walter would say, just as loud as the pastor out loud, "No, you are not." So this guy, he had a lot going on. But that first day, on the back porch, I kind of took a moment and I said to Walter, what is it that people who are living in places like the Good Samaritan mission really need? And I expected him to say things like, we need socks, or we need food, or we need a nice place to live, or we need a good education, or we need jobs. And Walter looked me in the eyes and he just said, "Derek, we need the same thing that everybody needs. We need hope." And he put out a cigarette and he got up and he went inside. And I just sat there kind of stunned, because he called me out. He surprised me, but he called me out on my entire life up to that point. Because I realized that with hope, I could endure any circumstance. Without it, the circumstances didn't matter. And I suddenly had to ask myself the question, why had I been spending my entire life chasing after, a good job, a nice house, a solid education? And were these really the things that life is about? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how, it just opened up my entire world, and it challenged me, but I grew to love it.
Right. No, that answers.
It changed my heart.
Yeah, I can see that. So it gives me some ideas of other questions I'm curious about. So you did this shortly after college. So how old would you have been when you were living homeless like this?
23. I would have moved in. It was June 1st, 2009. My birthday is June 22nd. So I would have moved in right before my 23rd birthday.
Right. And so practical stuff, would you have been staying in shelters? Would you have been in sleeping bags on the street? What did living this way look like practically? Yeah.
So it was a mission. And actually in the book, I used the name, the Good Samaritan Mission. The real name of it is the Star Gospel Mission. And they've since said, you can use our real name, which is, they would have been fine with it, but I just changed a lot of names for privacy.
Right.
And it was a halfway house where it was a dorm with 26 beds. Every bed has a locker. And you paid $80 a week, basically. So that was your food, your rent, your utilities, everything. And then you had to be out every morning by 7 a.m. and you couldn't come back until 4. And you had to go to church every week at the mission. No drugs, no alcohol, that kind of stuff. So, 26 men all living in the same room.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. So it's been 9 years since you did this, and your book, were you working on it immediately after this experience, or did it come to you as an idea, years after the fact? I'd love to explore some of that with you, because like I said, I talk to a lot of authors on this podcast, so my brain is going there as well.
Yeah, I think part of what I'm working through in my life now is that out of this experience, I started a nonprofit and a for-profit, so I've got an entrepreneurial slant. But ever since I was a child, teachers would tell me you're going to write a book, or you're going to write books, and the way that I've always processed my life is through writing. So I would actually write in the mission because just things were happening. And in the book today, some of the oldest and most raw essays, raw is usually one of the words that people describe the book. I wrote them when I was in the mission. So I did not have a plan to write a book then, but I could not keep myself from writing. And then I got tied up, starting the business for a long time. But then when the business was doing well enough that that things were not on my plate, I would always go back to writing. Like that was what I would do. So that's kind of how the book developed. And it finally just got to the place where I actually left the business. I'm still an owner, but I left the business at the end of 2016. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I just said, I don't care if this kills me. I just want to get this book done. Like, it's something that I want people to know.
Right. All right. So another practical question. So if you were writing while you were in the mission, would this have been handwritten on like a notepad, or did you have like a laptop or some kind of device, in that atmosphere?
Yeah, I had one of those little teeny like racer computers.
Okay.
That was just like like one of the really tiny ones. I don't even know if people still use them or not, but it was kind of a piece of junk, but it worked.
Right. Because I'm just thinking of the practical aspect of if you're in, a setting like this with other people who, for whom your nice device might be something they would also want or sell, steal and sell or whatever. Because I live in Peru. I live in, one foot in kind of one world and 1 foot in the other. And one of those feet, being with people who live in like shanty town, dirt floor kind of huts type of homes. And I'm conscious of what kind of items of mine I may flash around in front of them, not because they'll necessarily rob me or something like that, but just more like not accidentally reinforcing, like, look what I have that you don't and can't afford. So I'm just curious, as a writer, because I write way faster, like I type faster than I write. So you just got me curious, like, how would that work if I were in, me personally, if I were in a shelter for like a year, how would I scratch that itch of mine for writing on a regular basis? Because I can't fathom some of these details,
Yeah, I mean, well, two things. One is practical, and that is like always back it up to a hard drive or whatever, and put it on the cloud. But the second is that I think one of the things that like changed in me through the course of this year is I realized like I think people steal at the same rates regardless of their socioeconomic status. Like, people are honest and people steal at the same rates. The hypothesis, and it, the socioeconomic status doesn't really matter. People steal in different ways, but I guess I always just assumed that the men that I lived with, like they were not perfect human beings, but they were also human, and they were. If someone stole from me, I would have assumed that they really needed it. Right. So I was not worried about. And also, the culture was such that if someone stole, someone else would have stopped them. Right. So that was never. I actually felt very safe there. Like, I felt incredibly safe. Yeah. Yeah,
I have some friends back in my hometown in Canada who they all worked at this one particular mission. And, nobody would violate any confidentiality or, I don't know names or stories. But for a while I was working in a factory with a guy that I found out, like, well, my friend knew him because he sleeps at the mission. And I remember being impressed, and I thought, man, so this guy that I work with, he doesn't actually have somewhere to live, but like he's working, he's got a cell phone, he's, and I don't know what impression I had of people in those situations before, but I remember, being impressed, I guess, to see an example of where someone's got hope, like you mentioned, like that just like anybody, they want hope. And the other thing that kind of impressed me too is how technology has been changing so rapidly. This is like around 2008, 2009 when you did your
experience. And where is this?
This is my hometown back in Canada, named Peterborough. And how many people had cell phones, for like, if they're looking for a job, there's a way they can be reached, like the practical level, the practical aspect of that. And how fast that the technology has been changing so that, a cell phone's not out of reach for even, a homeless person, and this is I've been in Peru 9 years, so this is like almost a decade ago, and I assume it's gotten even better now with like smartphones and stuff like that being more affordable. But I didn't have a question out of that. just a thought.
Well, I mean, so I don't know that we want to go down this rabbit hole, but like, yeah, I mean, technology can definitely be a huge advantage for the poor. Unfortunately, I don't think, it's been a little while, but then I ran a company. Getting smartphones, like the poor are usually the last to have the best technology, so they're always behind that curve. But like everybody always has a flip phone, at least, because you need it for jobs and everything.
Yeah, to be reached, I would assume.
Yeah, and you're still human, so communicating is important to everyone.
Right, because in our church here, a small, organic church, I noticed more than one Sunday morning where our leaders would always give out the Wi-Fi password, and so we would have people, maybe like 30, 40 people on average is how many turn out, and all these young people who come over from Pacifico, which is this shanty town outside of Lima, they've all got these Android smartphones and stuff, and they're all they're all huddled in kind of like the living room using the Wi-Fi, makes me, I don't even have very much data on my phone, so I assume they might not either. But if there's like free Wi-Fi opportunity, that people come out of the woodwork for it. So and
Wi-Fi and Jesus makes the world go round.
Right. Well, and Wi-Fi and that kind of thing is one of the boons for this podcast, people being able to access it, listen to it. You are in England, I'm in Peru. People in America are going to listen to us chat because of these technologies, right? If you don't mind, I've got a story for you to confirm the whole that stealing thing. Just about, it doesn't matter the socio-economic level. The listener has heard this story already as I've gone into it, but for your benefit, I'll be as quick as possible. About a year ago, I'm
excited.
So like about a year ago, I misplaced my wallet, right? I knew immediately it probably was stolen because I'm very careful about my belongings in the neighborhood we're in. We're in what they call a red zone. It's a high crime area. And so I'd gone to the gym. I'm mindful of, my routine, and I made my protein shake at the, I poured the powder in it, mixed it, went home, and I'm always mindful everything is back in my little bag. And I'm in the kitchen doing something. I realized, crap, I left my wallet at the gym, even though I probably didn't. But so I run back. I go to the store that I'd been to and asked if they'd seen my wallet. They didn't. Go to the gym, and they're like, yeah, did you look at this machine or that machine? I saw you over here tonight. Where did you check there? So the next morning, I go to that store again and ask if they could look at their video surveillance, and and they're like, okay, well, maybe in the afternoon when the other guy who knows how to operate it, we could look and see if you left your wallet here while you're here. And I'm getting to the point where it's like a week later, I'm scheduled to go back to Canada for a flight, on a flight for my brother's wedding, and my Peruvian ID is in this wallet. It's basically my visa, my permission to be in the country. So when I get back from Canada, I need to present that. So I'm like, so I basically call my lawyer, my immigration lawyer, and I'm like, I think I need to get a new card because, my wallet I lost it or it got stolen. So I went through all the process. I went to like City Hall. I went to, I wasted like a day of my life. And then, so here's the sideline to that, or footnote. On the next Sunday, we did this event in a park near our house, a park near our leader's house, where we rented one of those inflatable slides. We, had barbecue and all this kind of stuff, and just put on this kind of like event for the neighborhood, not like an evangelistic preaching event or anything, but just a fun times kind of thing to kind of interact and get to know our neighbors. And, we had to plug in the oxygen, the air, to inflate that slide. We had to plug it into one of the neighbors' houses. And so there was this, 3 or 4 story house directly in front of where we had set it up. They let us, and Mark, my leader, offered to pay them something for, using all that electricity. And they said, no, I would never imagine, charging you guys for it. So, my wife stayed home. She had her 1-year-old. So I'm there with my, at the time, 3-year-old, and we come home, have lunch. And while I'm eating, I get a knock at the door, and it's the owner of that store that they had gone over the video surveillance, and I'm, condensing the story. And he said, look, he shows me on his phone when I leave my wallet apparently on the counter after I pay, and immediately this middle-aged woman zeroes in on it and picks it up. And in the video, she clearly pays for her stuff with a bill she took out of the wallet, right? Wow. So he goes, that's so-and-so. She's, her house is at the park. You ever seen her? She walks, these 2 dogs or whatever. And I was like, I have no idea who that is. I don't recognize her. So we get in his van and we go, and he takes me, and you know where he takes me to? The house.
The party.
Yeah, the house where the woman was letting us plug the slide in. And at first she, denies it, but then he shows the video and she goes, okay, well, and she goes and gets the wallet and comes back. And, my 2 100 soul bills are in there, which is like $60 or whatever. A third of that is what it would be in dollars. But the other smaller bills were gone. And she says to me, the temptation passed. I didn't spend any of it. And I'm like, wow. And this woman has a higher class of like living than I do. You know what I mean? Like she's clearly well off. And I'm like, and my ID is in there. You could see that I'm a religious worker. I've got a picture of my wife and daughter. So it's like, she said, I kept it because I was going to, give it back. But I'm like, in the footage, she zooms in on me, like after she realizes I left it there. You know what I mean? And I've got the picture, my name and address and all that kind of stuff in it. So like you could have done something to get it back to me if you really wanted to. But, anyway, that stunned me because I just assumed, like you, if somebody stole it from them, they must have needed it, but it was like a wealthy person,
Yeah.
And that rocked my world after years of living here and other experiences I've had.
Well, I guess 2 things on that. One is, one of the things that I kind of learned from the year that I was homeless is that, like, when you take the time to understand someone's story, it allows you to give them grace, and you may not come to a place of where you approve their behavior. But I came to wonder if it's not more important to understand like why somebody thinks the way they think and why they behave the way they behave than it is for them to think or behave in ways that I think are right. And so like I learned that from the year that I was homeless. But I don't know what this upper class woman's background is and what put her in that place. But I bet, if we got to know her well enough, we would understand where she was coming from. Doesn't mean it's okay to steal your wallet, but that understanding is helpful. The other thing, though, is that, for me, when I was talking about stealing, I think one of the things that my eyes really got opened up to in that year is fairly hard to articulate, but I would say that it's more about how we oftentimes make choices to steal without even being aware or with just assuming that it is the status quo. So a couple examples, one is that in Isaiah, it says, woe to you who buy up house after house and land after land until everyone's evicted and you live alone in the land. That's a common investment strategy in the United States. Like you buy up homes, rent them out, oftentimes in the cities, whatever. That's a very common investment strategy that loads of people do all the time. And yet Isaiah says, that is wrong. I think another form of stealing is one of the things that I became really sensitive to is the consequences of living in bubbles. And the United States is maybe, I don't. It's a very fragmented society. I think most of us would say. In churches where I'm from, white and black people, for the most part, do not go to church together, with rare exceptions. They, for the most part, don't live together, with rare exceptions. And socioeconomically, it's not just race, but socioeconomically and in other ways. So, I would say that when Jesus summarizes the law and he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He says, the law can be summarized by saying, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. I actually just wrote this and put it up. I'm going to pull it up really fast because I actually just bought a lot in a low income area, and I posted this, and people have been sharing it actually. Hold on one second. I just said this about bubbles. Yeah, I said that bubbles, or rather the cost to maintain them, too often keeps us from the work our hearts desire and our world needs. Bubbles too often keep us from seeing the pain of those different from us and how we can help them. Bubbles may decrease the likelihood of crime according to a government's laws, but they can also increase the chance of breaking a much higher law to love God with our entire beings and our neighbors as ourselves. So when you think about that, love God with our heart, soul, and mind, like I would say that part of that is purpose. Like, what are the gifts and talents that we each have as unique human beings, and how are we supposed to love them, enjoy them, give them to the world, and then give them back to our Creator? And when we live in bubbles, they're often so expensive. Like where I'm from, the town, I think the home prices increased from $300,000 to $450,000 from 2000 to 2015 through the recession. And it's often so expensive to maintain a bubble that many to most people, at least too many, are working occupations that they don't really enjoy. They're very stressed. They're not offering their gifts to the world and what can help others. And I would call that a crime, and I would call that stealing, and I would call it violating a much higher law. Of course, like God's working in people's hearts and their seasons, and I'm not the judge, but that's my general concern. The other one of loving your neighbor as yourself, when you can only love the neighbor that you can see. And that's kind of what I've learned in that year. And when you aren't around people who are different from you, you grow blind to the ways in which you develop judgments about those people. You also are kind of robbed because people who are different from you can open you up to see your own problems in ways that you can't see yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I would also call that stealing as well. So yeah, I kind of just went on my little, that's kind of like my passionate thing there. But that was the kind of stealing that I became like very sensitive to on a systematic level in ways that I would have never thought about had I just kind of fallen the beaten track.
Right. I'm gonna have to process some of that again, maybe while I'm editing or when I re-listen to this. No, because that's a lot of insightful perspective. I was having a hard time writing everything down that I liked that you were saying, but if I'm hearing you right, and again I gotta go process this later, but if I'm hearing you right, like there's basically these other ways we're stealing, by even if it's sins of omission, by not having these other perspectives and other people able to speak into our life. Am I getting the gist of it?
Yeah, and I mean our actions and lack of actions, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer says that human morality begins when we become willing to sacrifice our lives for our convictions. And so, like if I have a conviction of equality among humans, and yet I'm only willing to live around people that look like me and have the same educational status and socioeconomic status, my kids, I don't have any kids, but if I do, they will not go to the same schools as someone who is poor. And when they don't go to the same school, I'm in a sense like robbing those children of the talents and just the resources that I have that I can bring to the table, because I've made the choice to be absent. Whereas if I'm present and there's a problem at the school, like I'm going to step in and do what I can to make it as good as possible. So in the process of kind of like turning the blind eye, like I would say we're very guilty and responsible for the outcomes of our neighbors, not fully, right? But in part, the role that we have to play to love our neighbors ourselves, we're kind of abandoning that role.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as we're talking, you're provoking me to think about what I'm doing in the neighborhood we live in, what we're doing. it's not difficult to be reaching out and helping, the poor or less fortunate people than us. And, at the same time, I'm just going to be a bit vulnerable. And then if I feel like it, I'll just edit this out later if I don't want it in there. But, my wife and I, we live a modest lifestyle down here in Peru. We're not living high on the hog. We're, 15-minute walk away from a really rich upper scale neighborhood, and, maybe a 5-minute bus ride. It's not so easy to walk to, shantytown. Like we're right in the middle of both. And, my wife and I, we have our daughter in this Catholic school that for all intents and purposes would be considered a private school. But by private, I mean, like it's, you pay to, put your kid in it. It's not like, it's not expensive. Right. And that's how we're meeting these different parents. That's how we're meeting people that we're like inviting to our church or our home for meals. And sometimes my wife will say to me, hey, the other mothers have invited me to go do such and such. Can we afford this week? Yeah. And we're looking at like, people we're reaching out to, like we feel are a little bit out of our economic reach sometimes. Whereas, we invite people over all the time where we're the only ones providing the food or whatever. And at the same time, I guess like what I'm thinking about as you wrote this is, with regard to like, I wrote down a moment ago, you said, about wealthy and poor churches and schools and things like that. And I'm also wondering how difficult it is. You said, white and black people typically don't go to church together in your part of the world. But how often do like rich and poor people like have the same fellowship experience on a Sunday morning? Like where, the church is not just for like an outreach to the poor, and a church is not just kind of in an, upper class kind of suburban area that, a poor person would never set foot in. And if they did, it would cause a lot of disruption. Like, have you had any thoughts over the years since this, or as you've been on your journey of like, well, like how does one or a ministry, a group or a person do both fruitfully, where there's a way to interact with and blend, both ends of the socio-economic spectrum? I don't know if my question is kind of abstract, but
it is abstract, and
but does it make sense?
Well, I think so, but just summarize it in 15 seconds one more time.
How have you given thought to like how we could be ministering to both people at the same time? Not just kind of like an outreach or a mission to like the poor, and not just something that's, more for like upper class people. Because the same way you said, typically, the black and white churches don't mix too much. I feel the same is true of wealthier and poorer people as well.
Okay. Yeah. So this is what I would say to that. I would say that the night before Jesus is crucified in the garden, he says that it is through his body being one that the world will know that he's real. And he says it multiple times in different ways. And if the body being one is evidence that Jesus is real, then all I have to do to disprove that he's not real is to go to church in most churches in the United States. That is evidence in and of itself that Jesus is not real. And so either he's not real or he is, but we've got some problems. MLK, in his letter to a Birmingham jail, said this. MLK says, I'm just pulling up all my Facebook posts. There was a time when the church was very powerful, and the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and even vocal sanction of things as they are. One more paragraph. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. And that was, 1967, I want to say. Probably got the year a little bit wrong. But, part of the deal is that I think the United States is in a dangerous situation where the church it's not a thermometer that's changing culture. It's a thermostat that's reflecting a culture back to itself. And oftentimes, because it's reflecting that culture back to itself, and it's dependent on tithes to run its operations, it's kind of even put in a conflict of interest where it can't even really say the things that need to be said. And so I think that it's in a pretty dangerous place. I'm not a theologian. I'm not I'm just the son of a Baptist minister, but I think it's in a dangerous place. And that's really concerning for me as someone who loves the body of Christ. The thing that I would add to that is that when, in Revelations and throughout Scripture, like it gives lots of logistical layout, like architectural details. And we know that the New Jerusalem, it's a square, it's a city on a grid. And there's a great activist and journalist. Her name's Jane Jacobs. She wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she talks about things like how, and actually there's a great priest named Ivan Illich. The more intersections that you have in an area, the more intersections you have as those go up, your obesity rates go down. People are healthier, and they have the advantage of having kind of informal relationships that develop into friendships. And so the actual physical layouts of places and cities are very important. Ivan Illich, he has this podcast series called The Corruption of Christianity, and this is my last point. He talks about how the early Christians used to leave a piece of bread, a bed, and a candle for the wandering Christ who came by in need. And as they began to institutionalize charity, the early critics wondered if those families could even just by definition be Christian anymore if when the wandering Christ in need came by, they were sent to a church or a nonprofit down the street. And so my question would be, like, what would those critics say about my society where the rich and the poor live so far apart that there's no interaction at all? And if there is, it's like a volunteer thing once a week or once a month in a soup kitchen.
Right.
And so I would say, just in summary, as long as the American church is just reflecting American culture back to itself, like, you're never going to have unity in the body of Christ. The whole point of unity in the body of Christ is for it to be a thermostat that's actually changing society and demonstrating that Christ is real. But in our society, we just have lots of people that are afraid of all kinds of other people for all kinds of different reasons, with exceptions, of course. But that's the concern. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it makes more sense than I guess what I tried to ask. But you touched it. You kind of gave me some food for thought in your answer, in particular about the idea of intersection and the wanderer. You're saying a lot. I can't write down all the notes I'm enjoying taking. No, I take notes when I'm interviewing someone. Okay. And this is like, I'm just going to re-listen to that later.
Well, the question I'm asking myself is like, is it better to live a life where you're harmed by the one than to live a life of fear of the other 99? And, I don't know that Jesus is using it exactly that way, but he always talks about going off, in search of the one and leaving the other 99. Like, I wonder if we need to be living lives that are willing to be harmed by the one so that we don't have to live in fear of the other 99.
Right. And
I wonder if instead we're actually living lives of where we're, so avoidant of that one that we're willing to get rid of all 100, get them out of here. Everybody's afraid of everyone.
Right. That's good. You got some good tweetable comments in this discussion. I guess I'm thinking of, like you said, in American culture in particular, about the bridging that gap between the poor and the rich, not in just some kind of institutional way, because like my church culture here that my wife and I are a part of, our culture as leaders, like the culture we're trying to establish, is a lot of organic, a lot of informal as well as formal, so like not just the meetings and midweek Bible studies and stuff, but like informal gatherings, get-togethers, watching World Cup at someone's house, putting on a movie, having a potluck, these kind of things, where I think on an individual level, we do relatively good at the blend of people we bring together in an informal way, in these informal meetings. But I like, and I'm thinking about, I'm going to chew on what you said about, in that culture where they would have the food and the bed and whatever for the wanderer, as opposed to, sending them down the road to the more institutional, mission or something. I got to process that. That's some good stuff. So another thing,
and then when I actually have a place of my own, you'll have to call me out on it to see where I'm at, because see if I am practicing what I preach.
Right. Well, I mean, even something you said, in that, there's a lot, but there's one thing that jumped out. I made a note to bring up and ask you if you want to tackle it, was even, when some things come up, at least for me in social media, when people are arguing about government policies, not just in America, but, Canada or whatever as well, regarding, even I'll use a Peruvian example, that my wife and I were at a Chinese food restaurant yesterday, and on TV there was this little news thing about these areas of the country, because it's winter here now, areas of the country where people are freezing to death because like the government won't, go do anything to help them, get gas or get, technologies in their areas where they can heat their homes and things like this. There's no heating or AC here. It's all concrete. And I'm watching this video going, well, like, that's not anywhere near as cold as it gets in Canada. And, we've got systems in place. So like, what is the holdup? Like, what is it that like, the government will spend their money on stupid stuff, but like not, I don't know, do something to help, these communities. And so my wife and I were talking about that. So I was thinking, when is something like the government's responsibility and when is something our own responsibility? Like, when I see these conversations come up, I want to vote for this party or this person because they'll do more to take care of the poor or whatever. But like, if the church, if we were doing our job, we wouldn't need the government to, take care of people for us. I'm not trying to be sanctimonious or judgmental, but I feel like there's a truth to that. Like if in general, the church, whether it's institutional or the organic, the body, if we were doing a better job at like looking after the poor, looking after the less fortunate in our midst, then we wouldn't need to like vote on having a government do it for us. Like this wouldn't be as much of a discussion as I think it is. And I don't know I hope you don't say that that's an abstract question or comment for you, but what do you think?
I think a couple things. The first is that how am I responsible to do something and yet ultimately kind of helpless to do anything? And I think that was something I came through the realization through the book, like the experiences of actually living them out. But then certainly with the company that I started out of it, where we improved people's wages by 30%, and minimum wage in the state of South Carolina, where I'm from, is $7.25. And you can't live on that, but you can't really live on 30% more either. So, on the one hand, we did a great thing. On the other hand, it felt like we were taking people who were drowning 10 feet underneath the surface of the water and then pulling them up to 7. So, when the church is being the church, I think that we are attractive and we are certainly solving social issues. I don't know that it resolves them, until the day that Jesus comes back, but it certainly probably does a better job than we're doing now. Sure. And,
even the church is always said, we would always have the poor among us, right?
Hey, But listen to this. I just saw somebody, the guy who runs Sojourners, I don't know his name. He made a commentary on that. And that quote is always used. You'll always have the poor. And maybe he meant it that way. And again, I'm not a theologian. But the guy who founded Sojourners in the newsletter I saw it in from Richard Rohr, who endorsed the book, he says that what Jesus meant by that is he was saying that he expected his disciples to live in solidarity with the poor. And so he was telling them, like, you'll always have the poor with you because you will always live in solidarity and be with them. He wasn't saying like that is sort of like the brush off capitalist thing. Well,
I didn't mean it as a brush off, but more like a black hole where we're not. I don't know. I've always thought it meant like we're not going to be able to solve the problem, but that doesn't mean don't do anything about it,
Yeah. So I'm not a theologian, and maybe, but that was an interpretation that I'd actually never thought of before. In the past, it was always presented to me as like, kind of what you were saying. Like sometimes there's an excuse to not do anything, and then sometimes it's like, we'll do something, but this will still exist. That third one was one I never had even really realized until I read it. Man, you were saying. Oh, yeah. The one other thing that I would say, and you're stretching me out, like I'm really I need to put on my humility britches again.
That's fine.
I think that, Richard Rohr, again, who I really like, he was talking about how our answers, like Republican and Democrat, is the U.S. version. Sometimes we go to simplistic sides because holding the tension of the truth is too hard. So when you're talking about the approach to the poor, I think that what I noticed in New York was that, which is a more liberal place, and I lived there for a year. You can't even, if you have a good job. And I was unemployed when I was there. I was writing this book. You can't even walk to like church without passing by homeless people. You can't walk to your job. You can't go anywhere. And so I think that like a natural, like we've all got to do something with that burden and with that guilt. And so like sometimes, certainly both sides have their benefits, but sometimes the Republican side, you end up tending to blame that person for their situation, right? Like they have a drinking problem or they're lazy or whatever the answer is. They just don't want to work. And then I felt like in New York, like because it was so in your face, people wanted the government to solve that. And I think that sometimes at the end of the day, they're really just two sides of the same coin of kind of like passing the buck on to somebody else in a different way. And I think it's very hard to accept responsibility. And we don't really have a society that's set up for human beings to put in the investment of time that like someone needs. Like people are working very hard. They've got a lot going on. We're all chasing this idol of success. And the reality is like what a human being needs to pick themselves up from hard places that we've all experienced. It's a lot. And I think that for me, I don't ever get too high on the horse of thinking I can do anything, because I know that ultimately, like Jesus is the only person who is God who was able to take on all these problems and pain and suffering and deal with it. And he's able to empathize fully with everyone and know where they're at. So I don't know if that answers that question, but like when it comes to political systems and things like that, I think a lot of times their flaws are oftentimes the same thing, only from a different side of the coin.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. But like I said, you're provoking me to a lot of thought about some things that I think the listener will have to listen to this like 2 or 3 times to absorb it. So, and which I enjoy. I enjoy conversations like this. Okay, so I wrote down and I've not gotten you to elaborate on it, but like what exactly? Like this company you started as a result of, or in the wake of having spent a year living among homeless. Tell me more about the company you started and that you sold.
So I'm still an owner of it. But when I was working when I was living at the Star Gospel Mission, I noticed that all these guys were working day labor, and it surprised me that they had jobs. Like, I assumed homeless people did not have jobs, kind of like what you were talking about with in the factory that you worked in. So I thought, well, like, I'm observing so many parts of their lives, like I should go work with them. So I quit my job as a tour guide, where I was making like 20 to 25 bucks an hour, and then took a job making $7.25. Mm-hmm. And I only worked the job for 2 weeks. It was terrible. And we were working construction. And basically what day labor did is it contracted people's work out for $15 an hour and then pays back minimum wage, $7.25. And it made me angry. I felt like it was exploitative. And so I started a company where if our employees came to work, did a good job, and they're drug free, we paid them more, helped them get permanent jobs, and then provided them with coaching. And so that started, it's called IES Labor Services, or In Every Story. It started as a nonprofit. We then opened up a for-profit, and it employed up to 170 people on a daily basis. And it's still running today. So that's the company.
Right. So it's like a temp type of agency, but better paying or a better system for how that works.
Yeah, like just with the aim of doing what we can to help people move forward in life through the process, as opposed to kind of like getting stuck and staying where they're at.
Right. Yeah, because before, living abroad, like whenever, like I went to Bible school in the States, so I was living in Pensacola, Florida.
Where?
In Pensacola, Florida at first, and then Charlotte, North Carolina, or Concord, really. And so
what were the two schools?
No, it was the same school. It just moved. So it was called So it was called Fire School of Ministry. It still exists. It's up in, I guess, like between Concord and Charlotte. So if anyone knows that area, it's like a quarter of a mile up from the Motor Speedway. And so I would be home back in Canada for like short periods of time. So I would always call up manpower. I would go to the temp agencies and stuff to get work immediately, because, working immediately for like not the greatest wage was more ideal to me than looking and then maybe landing, like a high paying job, but only having a few weeks left or something before summer break is over. So I did a lot of temp work in those kind of transition seasons. And what I learned eventually was that like Manpower, the most kind of well-known one in my town, they would basically charge like a factory or a company like $16 an hour for the employee, but you get like $8 or $9 an hour. This is Canadian, and this is 10 years ago. And so gradually, like a lot of these companies would switch over to like these other temp agencies, like there was one I was with for a while called Staffing Connection, and they paid like the employee the same, but it seemed to me that the rate that they charged the company was lower. So it was much more in a company's interest to go with them than Manpower. And then the economic crash happened and stuff. And I think a year or two after I had been on the mission field and came home, like our town no longer has a Manpower. It kind of went out of business for various reasons, but I can't imagine the least of which would be how much it cost a company to hire through Manpower, if they're looking for temp employees. So the last place I worked went bankrupt about a month after, or maybe around the time I moved to Peru, because they made some kind of, plastic for car doors or some kind of thing where they spent like $2 million building a new like assembly line, paint line or something. And then the economic, the crash happened with all those three major car companies, and they basically had to default or something. I don't know. They basically, things were looking up before they looked down, and it really hurt them, right? And in a town our size, losing a factory like that is a big deal. So anyway, that's the last time I did some kind of steel toe boots type of work and safety glasses type of work. So, so you've got me interested just from that aspect because of having worked through temp agencies and stuff like that. And, there's perspective people have that, people with like no vision or no hope for their life do things like a temp agency, or they go to somewhere where they'll just get general labor or whatever. And I always hated that because I was I was doing temp work because I had vision for my life, and because it was like, I'm trying to get on to the next step of going, whether it's paying for Bible school or heading to the mission field and stuff. And I suppose there's people who are just kind of floating through life who get their work that way. But I always hated that perspective or stereotype when I'd hear it. Like there's this, you're this lesser quality of an employee if you're a temp.
Well, also, like, unfortunately and sadly, one of the things that I was always curious about was that when I lived at the mission, probably 80 to 85% of the men who lived there were white. When I started the company, probably 80 to 85%, maybe 75, 80% were African American. And there's probably a lot of different reasons for both of those things. But just one of the facts about staffing is that it is a place where someone with a criminal record can get a job. Whereas if they go directly to the company, it's oftentimes much harder.
Right.
A lot of times companies' policies will be, we can't hire anybody with a criminal background, but we can hire temporary employees. And then sometimes those companies will require that we also, don't hire anybody with a criminal background for their account, but others are fine with it if they're coming through a staffing agency. So, part of the reason why people get stuck there is because it's their best option.
Right.
For a crime that they did or did not commit. It really doesn't matter. The reality is that, like, people in our society get stuck somewhere and then they're stuck, for something they did in their 20s and they're now 55 years old. So that was, that's another reason for the day labor phenomena.
That's interesting to learn.
Yeah.
Right. So we got like 5-10 minutes, maybe max. I've got a few little notes I jotted down from your insightful, provocations, things you're food for thought you're giving me to think about. And did you have something you wanted to jump in and add, or? Okay.
No, I wasn't going to say anything.
Oh, okay.
But go ahead.
No, I thought you had something that you were about to chime in with, but you said something very interesting that, I don't know if it's like a passionate kind of subject of yours about the layouts in cities, when we kind of went off on that about the intersections and stuff. But you brought up, or you started to bring up, the layout of Jerusalem, the cubic city in Revelation. And I was curious what you were thinking, or, where you were going to go with that. Because you kind of mentioned about the layout of U.S. cities and stuff like that and how it's actually important. But did you have anything else you wanted to elaborate on about, I don't know, maybe you got some insightful revelation about that?
Well, I guess my concern is I wonder if people who insist on living in bubbles in the United States will be willing to live in the New Jerusalem if there is not bubbles there.
Right. That's a good point.
Pretty much, that's it.
Okay.
There won't be any bubbles. It'll be, I guess if there, again, all these things, I'm not a theologian. If only I was.
Right.
The measuring scale of what's important in heaven will be completely different from here. So, there's crowns or whatever that looks like, but it will not be based on the things that it's based on in earth. And so, are we okay with that? Or are we willing to live next to someone that's a different color than us, or has a different belief system or socioeconomic status?
Right. Gotcha.
What if they hurt our real estate value?
Right. Well, yeah, because I didn't. You mentioned that as a springboard, and I was curious if you had more. But I agree. If there's neither Jew nor Gentile in Christ, there's neither male nor female. There's neither rich or poor. And I've heard a preacher say, like, you might as well cancel your ticket to heaven then, if you don't want to be around like this culture or, this socioeconomic class or whatever, or if you think the worship is too long on Sunday morning, what are you going to do when you go to heaven and we're all of us together worshiping Jesus for forever? The worship was too long this morning. You might as well cancel your ticket to heaven then. Yeah. So I mean, might as well.
I guess.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, maybe one thing I can do is tell you a story from the book. But
sure.
There's a great book called Divided by Faith and the Problem of Race in Evangelical America. And it talks about how on paper, people who most care about equality, they'll take sociology surveys, if that's the right way to say it. And they'll ask these questions like, are you okay with having someone who's a different color over for dinner or working with someone who's a different color? And people oftentimes who are educated and then also religious will be the ones that are most likely on those papers to vote, yes, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. But at the same time, the ones who are oftentimes these groups of people more educated, they have more economic resources and they're actually the least likely to live next to someone who's a different color or work with someone who's a different color. And the deal in the United States, kind of going to the point of the book, is that it's not that people don't care about those things. They do care about those things, but we care more about exercising our economic opportunities to, have our kids go to good schools and live in quiet neighborhoods with low crime rates and good real estate investments. And so that's kind of the problem that I'm really getting at in the book, is this whole proposition that we have an idol of success and it needs to be replaced. And oh, by the way, the greatest health risk in the United States right now is isolation. Like, people are very lonely and it decreases life expectancies and increases chances of depression, heart disease. Oh, by the way, suicide rates are in 2014 the number one cause of death for Americans between the ages of 10 and 34, which is a wide range, but that's what the CDC puts out. And so, why is it that in a country that's so successful and powerful that its youngest members of that society are voluntarily electing to leave? The number one cause of death outside of accidents. So these are kind of like the questions that the book gets at. And you were just talking about the bubbles, and that was kind of where that came from and why I think it's important, rather a life and death situation, to not live in them. But one story that really in some ways was kind of my testimony. I'm living in the Mission. There's this guy named Gerald, and he kind of taught me the flip side of this. He taught me about community. And Gerald had one front tooth. He always wore a white tank top. And he asked me if I would take him to Walmart to buy a grill, like a barbecue grill. And I took him to Walmart. He said he had one. It was dirty. I suppose that he couldn't clean that one. And when we went to Walmart, we bought a grill for like $45. It was half of his weekly rent. And on the ride back, he told me that he was afraid he didn't have the money to pay his rent that coming week. And in my mind, I judged him. And I thought, anybody knows that living and having a roof over your head is more important in life than having a grill, like a barbecue grill. This is obvious. And I thought in my mind, you are dumb. You get what you deserve. When we got back to the Mission, I asked him why he had made this decision. And we were sitting on the front porch, and he just said, Derek, I just wanted something that guys could have, that we could kind of rally around, that we could enjoy each other with. And as I listened to him talk, I thought about all the things that he wasn't saying too. He'd become homeless in the past year. He'd fallen off of his bike and had to go to the hospital. He found out he was diabetic. And then probably most importantly, his father had passed away in the last year. And I knew, because he told me, that more than anything, he and his father loved to grill out. And so that coming weekend and then the following weekend, Gerald somehow paid his rent. I have no idea how. But he also cooked out for every single man in the Mission, all 26 of us. And so he then took all the leftovers and went around the East Side neighborhood and fed people who he never even met, against the cook's warning, who said, if you feed them, they might come back. And what Gerald did was not practical, and it was not all that responsible, but it was exactly what Jesus tells us to do. He says, when you have a feast, feed people who can never repay you. And that's what Gerald did.
Right.
We got up a day or two later, and we were late for work. And it was still dark outside. We were going to work day labor. And we were coming to this overpass where underneath it, a couple weeks before, a 15-year-old boy had been stabbed to death. And Gerald suddenly put out his hand and he said, Derek, stop. And I stopped, and I was really afraid because I didn't know if we were safe. And after a few minutes, he just said, okay, I think it's okay. We can go now. And he said, I thought I heard something. And when he said that, I felt something. And I realized that in my heart, I had changed, because I realized that not only was community and loving others more important to Gerald than having a home, but it also suddenly became more important to me as well. And I think that in a lot of ways, when I kind of tell people about like my own processing of faith and how I came to really believe in Christ, that for me is kind of like a fundamental story. And it also just radically changed, how I look at the entire world and what's important. Right. And that's an experience I could only have by being with him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're making me think of how in our community, Oikos here, we, for the longest time, the church budget was basically paid for by, the leaders tithing, all of us, the missionaries or the, people in leadership. I'm thinking of, for years, we would have potlucks where my wife and I, we would basically assume that after the potluck, we're going to go out for a meal. And what I mean by that is, for, how many times, we would have potlucks where there's more people receiving than giving, if you know what I mean. Like more people who are invited and can't afford, or for whatever reason don't prepare something to share. And, so there's no leftovers when, the meal, when the potluck is over, or, you could make something and wind up not eating because some people there don't know how to ration. They're maybe not certain of where their next meal is coming from. And so they're eating all they can at this one, and things like that. So, my wife and I kind of had this unspoken agreement that, we'll probably go get a bite to eat after the potluck. You know what I mean? And learning not to be resentful or feeling, superior or that kind of stuff. And it seems like in the last year or two in our church community, there's more people from like our specific neighborhood, and that this kind of thing has not been a problem like in the past. Like I asked you a question earlier about merging, both worlds, the lower socioeconomic and the wealthier or the more well-off people. And I think in some ways that's happening in our church to some degree, where I've noticed with the potlucks, like we could, get a plate to eat and there's leftovers, people can come and get something, even if they didn't, not like we're like some kind of mission and we just open and anyone who's hungry, come eat, but like I'm talking about planning something and people have time.
Yeah.
And so we're running out of time, but tell people how they can get your book. There's Amazon, obviously.
Yeah, Amazon is the best place. The Definition of Success, Derek Snook. Also, you can follow us on Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. And dereksnook.net has a lot of blogs, and it's DerekSnook.net. And if you kind of get linked up with us there, one of the things that's kind of cool about the book is we've made like a little overlay frame about all you need is hope, #purpose over success. And the book is really great for people who are Christians to give to people who are not, because it's just a story. And like I'm able to kind of like process it thoughtfully in a way that's kind of even keel. But people can accept or reject what they believe or don't believe, but they never really argue with the experience. So it's a really great book to just give to someone who's maybe thinking about meaning and purpose in their lives, especially young, but really all ages. And also people who are some of your listeners who may, not be quite sure what they think about Christianity in its current state.
Sure.
So yeah. And just so that, we'll send this out, but I mean, can you tell people in a quick snippet, like what you're doing in Peru?
Yeah, well, I moved here 9 years ago and initially came to be a part of, like a combination of a church plant / discipleship school. And for the last 7 years of that, I've been a part of something else that's doing just that. So my wife and I were heavily involved in discipling people in a non-organic, non-structured necessarily kind of way. Teaching in a, like a discipleship type of school, even though that's on kind of a hiatus at the moment. But the bulk of, what we're doing is relationship based, whether one-on-one or small groups. And my wife in particular, she's heavily involved in children's ministry, women ministry. I also do freelance online writing, interviews like this, podcasting. So those are the kind of things that keep us busy on a daily and weekly basis.
Cool. That's awesome. We need to watch out or I'll be down there to visit you.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to.
I probably will come.
Right. Well, I'm going to end this, but don't hang up when I I want to thank you, Derek, for being on this podcast this week, and thank the listener for checking us out. I hope you're as challenged and provoked as I have been for the last hour. And God bless you, Derek.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, did you enjoy that? I sure did, obviously. Or I wouldn't have done the interview. I wouldn't have published this. I wouldn't be sharing it with you. But you know who Derek reminds me of? Those of you who know Greg Montella, I've had him on the podcast a couple times over the many years I've been doing this. I think the last time was like 6 years ago. And, their personalities are way different, but just the industrialistic, go-getter, globe-trotting, change the world, think outside of the box type of on-fire single guys, the two of them are. Or maybe by the time I publish this, Greg's not single anymore. I don't know. We're praying for him. But I don't remember if I mentioned it in the published podcast, but I remember talking to Derek about it on our Skype call, about his TED Talk interview, TEDx talk, I should say. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. He did a TEDx talk a few years ago on this. And you know what? I'm right here in Amazon on my laptop here while doing this intro and outro. And I see, at least in my account, the Kindle version of his book is $6.95 and the paperback version is $9.95. So I'm going to write him an email right now and tell him he should raise the price to $9.95 on the Kindle and at least $15.95 on the paperback. And you may be thinking, well, Steve, why would you do that? I mean, I want to buy the book, but I'd rather pay little for it rather than a lot. And again, I'm big into paying people what they're worth. And this book of his is in good shape. It's a great read. And, it's like a good 200-page book. It's a good, hefty read. You could read it in 5 bathroom breaks if you take an hour to poop or whatever. That being said, when I raised the prices on my books, I've been doing Amazon ads for my faith book. In particular, I think I've put more effort into my healing book. And my friend Jonathan, who taught me how to do this, he was like, you should raise the price on your paperback. And then when we did, we started getting more sales on it. So there's something to be said about the way people perceive value. And I bet you he'll have more sales too. Just my expert author, writing coach, opinion, experience has taught me. I basically sell more copies of my book since raising them to $4.99. And they get a lot of page reads on Kindle Unlimited. So I'm not sure if Derek's book is in there or not. It doesn't appear like it. Nope, it is. So yeah, you can read it free on Kindle Unlimited, but for those of you who hate Kindle Unlimited like I do, it pays peanuts to authors, just so you know. If you want to really support your favorite authors, buy their books, and or buy them for other people too. So anyway, going off on a bit of a soapbox, but thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Go get Derek's book, go check out his website, and fire on your head.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, or directly at fireonyourhead.com for more options. If you want to support Steve and Lily Bremner as missionaries in Peru, or find out more about what they do, be sure to head over to their blog at stevebremner.com, or check out Steve's Kindle books on Amazon and leave reviews of the ones you liked. See you next time.